So let's start. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to the guest speakers, presenters, and participants to the third session of the conference titled Relevance of International Debates on Pluralism in Economics Education to the Indian Context, which is a joint effort of Satyavati College, Delhi University, and Rethinking Economics India. Now, pluralism in economics has now been a long-standing demand of academics and policymakers, especially to the real-life application of the subject. The way in which economics is taught and introduced to the students in colleges, especially to the undergraduate level, has a long-standing and long-lasting impact on how students view the subject and how students apply them in their real life. Through this session, we attempt to learn from international experiences that go beyond India so that we can introduce economics to Indian students in an impactful way. This session is chairperson by Professor Surajit Majumdar. Dr. Surajit specializes in the areas of political economy, Indian industrialization, and globalization. Over the years, he has made an important contribution to the subject with his research and knowledge of the domain. The session has 5 paper presenters. The first paper, which is titled as A Political Economy Syllabus for 21st Century, will be presented by T.M. Thomas from Deshbandhu College, Delhi University. He has contributed in the field of teaching and academics for more than 4 decades now and needs no introduction for his work. Followed by this, we have a paper, A Political Economy Approach to the Agrarian Studies by Shantanu De Roy from TERI. Dr. Shantanu De Roy, with his knowledge and experience, has done great work on the subject, and he specializes in the areas of agrarian studies. Unfortunately, he won't be able to he won't be able to speak for his paper today, but we have a recording for him, which will be played for his session. Next, we have a paper, Epistemic Inquiry into the Application of Economic Thinking to Healthcare by Shalini Rudra. She's a PhD scholar from University of Warwick and making new contribution to the areas of public health and public policy frameworks to improve public health. Followed by this, we have a paper on niche in the undergraduate macroeconomic classroom by Dr. Krishnakumar S. He's an associate professor from Sri Venkateshwar College, Delhi University, who specializes in the areas of niche and international monetary system. And the last paper is Formulating, a course on the history of economic thought by Ajay Ranjan Singh. He's from Kirorimal College, Delhi University. Now I request Dr. Surajit to take over and help us to take the session forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirti. Very good evening and welcome to this third session of the Rethinking Economics Education Conference. Since Kirti has already introduced all the 5 panelists to all of you, I won't waste time repeating the details. Just say that I'm very happy to be in this session with colleagues, both more experienced than me, as well as those who followed me into the teaching profession, and some of who are almost contemporaries of mine. We've been colleagues, so it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today to chair this session. Each speaker, I'm told, is supposed to take about 15 minutes, in which case we could finish with all the additional time by about 1 hour 20 minutes, which will leave us some time for a discussion. So we'll follow the order that is mentioned in the program. So to begin with, T.M. Thomas with his presentation on the political economy syllabus for the 21st century. Over to you, Thomas.
Okay, excellent. Let me just, it says, only the host can share in this meeting. Okay, I need to be allowed to share content. Okay, right. Now it's okay.
So when the time is coming to an end, I'll use the chat to inform. Okay.
Yeah. Shit. Doesn't seem to be working anyway.
Thomas, move the slides from the
Okay, now?
sidebar. If it is not moving, use the sidebar to move the slides.
Okay, right. But has it come?
No, it's not. It's not visible right now.
Just one
It
second.
was visible.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
Now is it okay?
No, we can't see it. Now it's come.
It's okay? Right.
Are
Is it
you
okay?
broadcasting a screen?
Yeah. That's how I'm doing it.
Okay.
Is it on? Can you get the screen?
It will come in a
I
minute.
can't.
It will come in a minute.
Why is it not working? Is there a problem with mine? I think we'll have to.
It says you have started screen sharing, but nothing is coming.
Okay, then look, I'll do it without that. Okay. What else can I do? You are sharing screen and it's just not. Let me start again. Just one second. I'm sorry for the problem.
What file are you using?
It's a PowerPoint basically. And just one second. I'm so sorry, guys. It's really bad.
You open it on your desktop first.
I've opened it.
Then share it.
Yeah. And now, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Now, even though I'm not able to share the screen, let me just go through it, and later on maybe we can do something about it. Okay. Look, I just don't know exactly what is the context of this discussion, because as I can see around me, the trend is towards increasing centralization of syllabi making. And I hope that what we are doing now will prove of some use to the debate that is going on. Now, I'll just start with a few things, a very ambitious idea of what a 21st century syllabus should be. What are the new things that we need to take into account in a syllabus for the 21st century? Threat of environmental disaster, new developments in artificial intelligence and human biology, increased vulnerability to the spread of disease, and the retreat from the old globalization, and the possible emergence of rival trading blocs. I'll come to these things, some of these things in detail later on. But what I would like to say is that if we want to have a forward-looking syllabus and we want to address the concerns of our students, then some of these issues will have to be tackled. If we can't do them thoroughly, we should at least have give some kind of recognition to these issues. Now, why do I say some of these things are important? See, because whichever way you look at it, political economy, Marx said that political economy provides us with the anatomy of the material conditions of life. Okay, so if you can think of anything that affects your material conditions of life, it's certainly things like the environment, the problem of disease, the problem of rival trading blocs, and so on. So what I can see now is I also feel that in the initial part of a course on political economy, one has to live with the fact that we are talking to a body of students which is already indoctrinated to a great extent by the marginal school. And I have always found it useful in my teaching career that one has to give them a kind of overall criticism of the marginal school. In the old days, which I think it was a very useful way to do it. There's that old book by, it was a collection by Hunt and Schwartz. It was called The Critique of Economic Theory. And the introduction to that had a very good summary of what is the problem with modern macroeconomic theory. Having done that, what we have to see is that when we do our political economy course, it should not be what has been called mechanical Marxism. We should also give them some acquaintance with the institutionalists, the Frankfurt schools, Antonio Gramsci. There has to be some reference, particularly in the Indian context, to the caste system.
Thomas, can you stop your sharing then and put on your video?
Just 1 second. Let me do it in a second. I have located the problem actually. I have located the problem and it should be okay now. Is it now coming?
No, it's not.
It should come. Is it coming?
No, it's just, there's a line which says you started screen sharing, but nothing is showing.
Okay, then we'll just go back to Zoom. And I'm so sorry because of what has happened. Can you see me at least?
Yeah, so you stop the sharing, then we can see you properly.
Okay. Now, what I was arguing was that as a young teacher, what I found was that most of the time, when we were teaching political economy, in the old days, as some of you would recall, it used to be called economic systems. And subsequently, it got called economy, state, and society. And subsequently, it was called political economy. But what I would say is that the problem was that there was an emphasis on making it basically a course on Marxism. And that also, the problem was that we tended to use, what is nowadays characterized as official Marxism. The standard textbook used to be Oskar Lange. And though a close reading of Oskar Lange will give you a different impression, if you read it as a student, you would definitely become a victim of what is called economic fundamentalism, an attempt, and Lange, in fact, repeatedly tends to go to that extreme, underplaying the role of the superstructure. And on various occasions, the problem becomes that as our students, I'm sorry, I'm getting some, is it now okay?
Hello? Now we can see.
Okay. So what I was saying was that the problem was that the students coming out of the course on economic systems or political economy would be having a kind of very confused situation. They would be giving one kind of answer to one question. Suppose you put a question paper and you ask different questions. Supposing you ask a question on Schumpeter and you ask a question on, the Marxian theory of the mode of production. And you would get very, very different perspectives. The problem was, in effect, that you were compartmentalizing the whole thing. So what I feel is that we need to do away with that. So that is one important aspect that we would need to do. The second thing which I would like to say is any course on economic systems must necessarily start with the study of the initial creation or the foundations of capitalism. And I think there the important thing is that though we have been using various textbooks, the problem has been that the role of colonialism and imperialism in the early development of capitalism has been missed out. It's only with the incorporation of Irfan Habib's book, a small article on capitalism in history, that trend has been changed. And I think there are enough grounds for giving it the prime role in the understanding of early capitalism, which should then be followed by other books that we know about. And for example, there is the article by, I'm so sorry, E.K. Hunt, the first chapter or two on economic theory, which is a good survey on economic history. And then Michel Bord. So this is my understanding about how we should start with the theory. Then we come to the actual core, the core of the syllabus. And here, I think that, any attempt to provide political economy syllabus must necessarily include the foundation of the Marxian theory of exploitation and simple and expanded reproduction. And for that, obviously, what we already have been using for many years is adequate. That is Sweezy, and then the articles by Anwar Sheikh, and in recent years, Vamsi Vakalabaranam, that would be adequate. Now, when I come to the international dimensions, then we come to one more aspect which I would like to take up, that is the Indian context. Here, I think the point has been made by a number of speakers in the previous session that caste is a reality of India, and that is something that we cannot ignore in any political economy syllabus. And it is very fortunate that we have a number of very accessible articles on this. Of course, we would necessarily we should begin with Dr. Ambedkar's Caste and Class and the Annihilation of Caste. And there are, from an economic point of view, I think Ashwini Deshbandhu's book on the grammar of caste would be a very suitable introduction for students of economics to the importance of this. And in a similar vein, not in a similar vein, I should say, in a different kind of context, it is necessary to have an overview of alternative views of what this caste system has meant for India. And there, Surinder Jodka's book on caste, which is a very brief and nice summary of various debates, would be a very useful thing that we should put in. Now, the last part would necessarily have to be on the international dimension of modern capitalism. And here, one has to take into account what has been happening in recent years. But of course, it has to be done in a proper historical context. We necessarily have to start, as we used to do in the past, with the meaning of economic imperialism by O'Connor, and then follow it up by Prabhat Patnaik's book on, article on the meaning, on imperialism, the important point here is that I would remind people that in his book, in his article on imperialism, which we have been using for some time, Prabhat Patnaik says that in the modern era of capitalism, it has developed its own special system which he calls super imperialism, which is founded on the overwhelming superiority of the United States over all its rivals. And I think here, what we need to take into account is the latest developments which indicate that internationally, at least, this old model of globalization is coming unstuck. As we all know, in Donald Trump's time, not only did he levy unprecedented import duties on Chinese imports, he undermined the WTO. And now, with the further steps which have been taken following the Ukraine war, one can see that the old model of globalization is getting undermined. And I think in that context, it would be necessary to go back to some of the books that we have been using for some of the other courses, which deal with the foundations of the Bretton Woods system and how it came unstuck. And then in that context, bring in the idea that after the downfall of the Soviet Union and East European socialism, how that unipolar moment is coming to an end. And we are now in a new era, which would require a reconsideration of many things, including the model of globalization. And we would possibly see a return to rival trading blocs and a situation where every economy in the world, including India's, would need to take that into account. I hope I have not exceeded my time limit. I'm sorry for the mess up in the beginning, though I revised this whole thing. And the reason why the talk has been a bit disjointed is because of that earlier problem, which has not been resolved as yet. I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. In fact, I was just about to send you a message about the time, but you managed to conclude on your own, so that wasn't necessary. So thank you for keeping to the time. So the second presentation is by Shantanu De Roy on a political economy approach to agrarian studies. I believe he is not well and therefore will not be speaking. A recording of his presentation is going to be played out. So can I just request the organizers to play the record?
Title of my presentation is A Political Economy Approach to Agrarian Studies. Basically, in this discussion, what I intend to do is to raise certain issues which I feel to be extremely relevant as far as understanding, in terms of understanding agrarian life is concerned. And any course, in my view, on agrarian studies must incorporate some of these issues. In this discussion and presentation, I do not intend to find answers to these questions because, one, the research is still ongoing. There is no last word as of now as far as these questions are concerned. And secondly, I would like to get some suggestions, and I would like to get some suggestions and comments from the audience who are present here and seek their opinion and suggestions vis-a-vis each of these positions. So, I mean, there is no attempt from my side to actually, to actually get answers to these questions. Now, let us directly go to the issue. Now, this is, as I said, the title is Political Economy of Agrarian Studies. Now, broadly, there are three aspects of political economy which are considered to be extremely important. These are accumulation, class, and state. Now, what is accumulation? Accumulation is not about accumulating precious metals, money, or wealth or durable consumer goods. It is about accumulation of the means of production to carry on with the process of production and furthering this process of accumulation in the subsequent cycles of production. Now, it is considered to be the cornerstone as far as capitalist development is concerned. Now, any analysis of accumulation related to accumulation is incomplete, or the pace and the nature of capitalist transformation of society as well as agriculture will be incomplete if we don't analyze or take into consideration the social character of the classes who are spearheading this process of accumulation. Now, the root, the causes, and the dynamic of capital accumulation needs or requires a class-based analysis. Now, thirdly, the role of the state is very, very important. State, well, Marxist researchers for a long time has been arguing that the state has a class character. And at the same time, so any policy of the state has a class bias, and it depends on the nature of the state. Now, state facilitates to its policies the process of accumulation, and through this process, some classes become dominant, and they in turn become the pillar of state power in the society as well as in the rural areas. Right? So there is, one can see a dialectics between state and the emergence or the dominance of certain classes, which are a direct outcome of state policies. Now, these are very, very important in terms of understanding the agrarian question. Now, what are the agrarian questions? Broadly, there are three components of agrarian question. The first component is about the nature of development of capitalism in the countryside. It is about the path of capitalist development. That is, whether the path is a landlord based or landlord-led path, or it is a peasant-led path. Now, if it is a landlord-led path, then by and large, the process of capitalist transformation is not so broad. It benefits only a few. And it actually excludes large sections of the agrarian population with associated repercussions in generation of surplus for industrialization. On the other hand, the reverse is true. When the capitalist transformation is much more broad-based, it is much more peasant. It is led by the peasants, who are the majority sections of the population in the countryside, particularly in the context of developing economies. But this creation or generation of surplus for industrialization or agrarian transition is just not the only component of the agrarian question. The second very important question is the classes that emerge based on the development of capitalism. What are the defining features of the classes? How can one identify the classes? Who are the landlords? Who are the manual workers? Who are the big capitalist farmers? What is the difference, or what are the differences between landlords and the big capitalist farmers? Who are considered to be the pillars of state power in the countryside? Who can be the potential allies? Now, based on this, we come to the third question, which is basically a political question. It is about mobilization to initiate class struggle. Now, who will be the potential allies in this class struggle? Can landlords or big capitalist farmers become potential allies in the class struggle? Or someone else or other sections of the agrarian population can become potential allies in a progressive and democratic transformation of the society, as well as progressive and democratic transformation of production relations in agriculture, which is the mainstay of living in the rural area. So these are the broad components of agrarian question in the countryside. Now, in the global south, by the way, I mean, the point to be noted is that The agrarian question in the global south, it's fundamentally different than the global north. Primarily because there is a long history of colonial subjugation in the global south. So for a long time, the primary question for the peasantry is to attain freedom from imperialist yoke, imperialist domination. But even after attaining political independence, the issue of generation of surpluses, the pattern of industrialization, agriculture, industry, linkages, the pattern, an autonomous development trajectory, which is decoupled from imperialist domination, became extremely crucial, right? In the context of global south. And agrarian question is inextricably related to this particular issue, because at the time of independence, and most of these nation states in the global south had attained independence after Second World War, between 45 and 1970. At the time of independence, majority, in some cases 80% of the population were based in the rural areas. So whatever was happening in the agricultural sector, whatever was happening in the rural areas had repercussions for other sectors of the economy. And this actually can be seen from the second point, as that this question is very crucial in the context of nation states in the global south, particularly a country like India, where close to 2/3 of the population stays in the rural areas. So any policy which impacts rural development, which impacts rural economy, levels of living of agrarian population in the rural areas impacts the entire society. So resolving the agrarian question is a foremost national question in the context of global south. Now, none of this actually is true in the context of the northern countries, because they had actually, they had colonized the tropics. They got resources primarily through loot and plunder. So this history was just not available to the nation states in the global south, located in the global south. So actually they have to start from the scratch. So in this senses, the agrarian question in the global south is fundamentally different from the northern states. Okay, these are some of the specific questions of agrarian. The first is about the nature of capitalism, the nature and development of capitalism. What is the path of capitalism? The first question perhaps may be that what is the mode of production? Is it capitalist? It is fully capitalist, or there are some pre-capitalist remnants? What kind of pre-capitalist remnants exist? For example, if we just go to a place called Fatehbad, which is not very far off from Delhi, New Delhi, you may see exploitative labor tenants relations called city labor, right? Which is characterized by large degree of unfreedom. Those who are cities, they are simply not free. Freedom in the double sense, freedom from the means of production, freedom to choose their own employer simply does not exist for the city workers, right? So what is the kind of production conditions, a mode of production that exists in the countryside? If it is capitalist, what the vehicles of this capitalist development process? Is it true across India? What is the implications of the development process in terms of furthering the accumulation process, furthering the growth process of agriculture? Does it put any break, the nature of development, on the growth process itself? So this is a very important question, which directly determines the level of development strategy. It is contingent on the nature of state, and the development strategy has changed over the years and are quite natural. For example, immediately after independence, the state tried to intervene to alter agrarian land relations in the countryside. They tried to implement land reform. It turned out to be a failure. But because of this, certain classes actually emerged. The landlords, capitalist landlords, a section of rich peasants. Then you have a class of landless workers. The process of differentiation actually gathered momentum with the onset of the new agricultural strategy, which is basically an import substitution in agriculture, in which the state played a very, very crucial role in facilitating the accumulation process. In fact, the accumulation of certain sections enable those sections to diversify into the non-farm sector, both in the rural areas as well as in the sectors like education and health. And taking advantage of changes in the state policy. By 80s, the state started to liberalize the import on goods. So equipments produced in the developed and advanced capitalist nations, equipments in the health sector can be accessed more cheaply, which facilitated the setting up or diversification process of these sections, of these agrarian classes. Now, but then in the 90s, there were changes in the development strategy. There were changes in the macroeconomic regime. Now, the fact of the matter is, due to these changes, did it actually break that, break that relationship between the state and the dominant classes in the rural areas? Is it really the case that the rural elite had stopped the process of accumulation in the countryside? Now, here comes the question of agrarian crisis. Is agrarian crisis undifferentiated? In other words, is it the case that every section of the rural population are equally affected? Or it is a case of differentiated misery? An outcome of agrarian crisis is an important outcome. Is the market for hired labor became extremely broad-based. So because agriculture became increasingly unremunerative, sections of the agrarian population, particularly the middle classes, which either did not participate in the market for wage labor, hired labor, they started to participate. So the market for hired labor became actually very important. So there was a process of proletarianization that was going on even in the pre-reform period, but there is a process of semi-proletarianization also that can be witnessed, which is a fallout of this agrarian crisis. Now, associated with this broad-based, increase in the market for hired labor, there is a proliferation of the non-farm sector. So, is the proliferation of the non-farm sector a manifestation, an outcome of distress, or an outcome of dynamism, or a combination of both in varying degrees? This is an important question that can be explored. The other question is, of course, about ecological sustainability. Now, in the present setup, the present form of capitalist development, can this capitalist development trajectory become ecologically sustainable as well as economically sustainable? Is there a diversion between firm ecology and firm economics? Is that diversion increasing with time? Is it related to the access to land, unequal access to land and other non-land resources? So the question of ecological sustainability cannot be looked in isolation. It is directly related to the pattern or the nature of capitalist development of Indian agriculture. And last but not the least, it is also about acquisition of farmland for the corporate-led industry, encroachment of the corporate sector for non-farm uses, right? Now, is it a case of primitive accumulation? Who are the beneficiaries of this whole process of land acquisition? The landed sections, are they getting benefited from this? Does it show some kind of a rupture between the state and its pillars, or the pillars of state power in the rural areas? Right? Now, if that is indeed the case, is it possible to form an alliance which is much more broad-based, that encompasses perhaps the landlords, big capitalist farmers, down to the manual workers, a broad-based alliance? What will be the nature of the class struggle in this corporate, in this particular case, against corporate-led land acquisition? Now, these are some of the questions. Of course, these are not exhaustive. That can be put forward, that shared with the students, and the students must be exposed to these questions which are issues which are directly related to the well-being of the agrarian population. I'm sorry that I have to actually record this lecture because I'm down with fever and there is a sore throat. But then I was not very confident that I'll be able to speak for so long, particularly when there is a question, answer, and a discussion following this presentation. But then I'll be gladly willing to participate in discussion. I'm glad you will respond to any question that will come up based on the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shantanu. Is there anything that you wish to add?
Not really. I think let's just wait for the question and answer session, and then we can move ahead.
Okay, so then I'll invite Shalini Rudra, who's going to make a presentation on epistemic inquiry into application of economic thinking to healthcare.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity for presenting. And like I heard somebody said in the last session, by writing or by participating in this conference actually helped me to put all my thoughts together into writing about why I think epistemic inquiries are important in any discipline, and specifically in economic. And I'll just give you a small background to my research. I'm actually doing PhD at University of Warwick, and my work is situated in Department of History. So I'm working in the Department of History, and my work is basically looking at the access to medicine campaign and how India played a very specific role. And I'm trying to see that in the context of the larger political economy framing of counterfeit medicines and how India trade prowess is being sometimes jeopardized because of politics that surround medicines. And because I have a big ground to cover for my presentation, I think I'm going to skip some of the slides. I initially thought that I'll have a half an hour to discuss my work, but unfortunately, I don't think so that will be the case. So I'm going to, because I have a very big ground that I need to cover, I'm going to present my slides, but also skip through some. Can you see my slides?
Yes, they are visible. The slide is visible.
And is it gone to presentation mode?
Yes, it has.
Thank you so much.
Just check that it's moving.
Yes, I will. Is it all right now?
Yeah, fine.
All right.
Please
Just
go ahead.
1 second, because I have two screens. I have to put this in one place. Yes, so my presentation is actually about what the teaching pedagogy of like the sub-discipline learn from its application in wider world. And I will start by presenting just a small introduction of what pluralism means and what pluralistic disposition of a discipline is. So pluralistic disposition of a discipline refers to its specific quality that can be adapted to analyze, describe, characterize multiple situations. I situate this within the descriptive domain of knowledge, which is presented by its internalist and externalist paradigms. Now, differentiating pluralistic disposition from pluralism, I'm referring pluralism to something which is like a theory that legitimizes, that supports and legitimizes a lot of different things within a similar paradigm by adopting a critical and a reflective lens. by that definition, pluralism then becomes an inherent nature within the application of economic knowledge. Like there are multiple theories, methods, values, schools of thought, and they all can be used to explain one thing or something which has applicability across these domains. So plurality is then a normative concept, and one needs justifying the use of plurality based on either relating to epistemology or pragmatism, or just based on ethical lines. So the demand for pluralism in teaching has started as a part of a student movement, and I'm sure everyone here is associated in some ways with Rethink platform. So we already know why it started and what are its origins, and how we think that reflective and critical perspective is important for understanding not only what the discipline has emerged of or come out of in historical or its historical trajectory, but also what it can do, how it can how it can cast its wider net to understand larger issues and philosophies that feminist, ecology studies, anthropology, history, and discourse analysis, and so on and so forth brings. The dimension over which a discipline can be diversified also aligned with the subject it discusses. And since social sciences consist of studies of people, societies, communities, and behaviors containing elements of indecisiveness, we understand that one logic or one conceptualization will not fit into any very tight interlocked paradigm. And economics act as a mixed basket when it comes to plurality, because we know that behavioral economists boast about quantifying behavior that are difficult to explain or difficult to quantify. And there are studies like Douglas North's work where economies and individual choices are, it's been understood that people preference and behaviors are molded by institutions. Similarly, Basu's work on altruism, norms, and laws also talks about broadening reasoning outside the traditional epistemic framing of economics. And recently, Daniel McFadden's work on how perceptions are formed based on experiences which cannot be described simply by using maximization principle are few of the examples. Now, from the discipline, because there's been, sorry, I'm not. So from the discipline, there's been always voices that say that economics is already pluralistic, and there are other that say that the disciplinary approach of having multiple methods does not really mean that a discipline is pluralistic, and it has to go beyond its understanding of its categorization. So it's basically ontological understanding of themes. And my question, the question that I am posing here is not what the discipline already is, but what it can be if its objectives are broadened to include parallel fields and understand areas that it hasn't touched upon. So to fulfill that deficit, studies have models where like historical work, quantitative analysis, socioeconomic, ecological framing, cultural studies, and all have been used to sort of complement what economics is already doing. But then that's also in some ways that split creates a sort of a substitutive and a complementary sort of understanding, or a core and periphery hierarchy, and marginalizes certain epistemological perspectives. So that's also not the best way to go about it. But because in the absence of lack of quantification of everything, I think that is some substitutive studies or complementary studies, something that everybody is nowadays resorting to. Randomized control trials and experimental economics is something which fits this bill. So a growing number of commentators from within and outside the discipline have raised how within the discipline, there's also a cultural bias towards more empirical and theoretical themes. And a lot of work recently has come out about how publications and selection and sort of promotion, all sorts of things are valued more if somebody's a hardcore empirical based economist rather than somebody who's worked in soft areas like health. So keeping in mind with similar argument, my intervention will begin with presenting a case of healthcare markets that represent the concentration of most of these departures from the the orthodox understanding of economics or market. And in this paper, what I tried to do is I presented a sort of an epistemological critique of theoretical claims that standard economic theory claim the standard economic theory to question when markets function at non-optimal level in healthcare. Why isn't there a parallel system of healthcare market governance? In fact, the paper proposes that the pluralistic views about healthcare and property rights that India encouraged in early phase of planning era represent a case for challenging the neoclassical utility maximization sort of ideas. So I'll talk about how healthcare is defined by presence of specific features which gives it a characteristic of something where beyond economic reasoning has to be employed to make an impact. So healthcare is defined by presence of externalities, traditionally described as indirect effect of an economic activity on the consumer or producer by impacting their respective utility and production functions. Indirect also refers to the cost and benefit caused by someone not directly involved in the transaction, and therefore such costs do not reflect in the price system. Externalities are vastly diverse and unknown to an extent that they can influence the parties even remotely. Provision of healthcare is the most obvious example of the presence of externalities. Public investment in nutrition during first few years of life, for instance, creates conditions like cognitive growth and cognitive development, which enable the individual as economically productive and healthy, throughout her adult life, creating high social marginal cost for such investment. Healthcare also is defined as a public good because it creates externalities by impacting parties involved as well as outside the transaction, but also because consumption of one person does not diminish its consumption, availability of consumption for the other. So this is a standard non-excludability, non-rivalry in consumption of a public good description. There are also information asymmetry that dominates healthcare consumption in preventive as well as curative treatment. In the simplest term, information asymmetry refers to lack of all information. Individuals need to make correct decisions. Now, because patients do not lack information about all types of or efficacy of treatments available for the condition they're describing, hence they rely on expertise of doctors, which is also known as the principal agent problem, so doctors act as an agent on behalf of patient. Such asymmetries of knowledge between specialists and clients leads to typical principal agent problem in which the outcomes are inefficient because their agents, like patients' agents, are trying to act to maximize profits and not the outcomes. Based on Arrow's work in health insurance, we also know that healthcare is characterized by imperfect information, which leads to suboptimal outcomes, resulting into adverse selection in insurance. Because of this, people who are high risk may self-select into insurance programs, or people who are not high risk will modify their behavior after purchasing an insurance, knowing that they are no longer fully responsible for their actions. And some insurance company firms will pay for their expenses. Now, there's also a presence of market failure where externalities linked to another important identifier, which is market failure, when there are differences between private and social costs and benefits. In such situation, market fails to arrive at an optimal solution, and it creates a situation where buyers and sellers try to maximize respective outcomes and completely ignore the external effects of their actions. Now, because of the presence of such stark departures from how any market would be viewed, we also know that there are some political economy experimentation that has happened within healthcare in last 3 or 4 decades. And I'm going to talk about those and how they offer an opportunity of incorporating pluralistic thinking through a deeper inspection of those situations. So first, that health is a prerogative of national governments, and policies are rarely sole product of national government decision making or policy making. And the best example of this is when all the nations underwent trade. In the post-war, major upheaval in such nationalized organization of health occurred when a couple of decades later, after post-war World War II, the countries went into debt and they had to seek financial assistance from IMF and World Bank to resolve the balance of payment crisis. Now, International Monetary Fund and World Bank offered assistance which precisely varied from country to country, but had very specific features that aimed at increasing the scope of market, and they were non-negotiable, coercive, and there were stringent features that involved liberalizing trade, altering investment policy, deregulating markets, disinvest loss-making entities, public entities, and reworking current currency exchange rates. Now, there were many indirect and direct effects of structural adjustment programs. India also adopted a grant from IMF and World Bank and opened its economy in 1990s. And the impact of structural adjustment programs is still contested, but overall, among the commentators and academia and policymakers, there's an understanding that health was conceptualized as a private good. The state intervention in health was frozen. State interventions were permitted only on the grounds of efficiency. So the investment was limited to high outcome producing sort of intervention, which also led to private sector. The other areas of investment in health left for private sector, and private sector investment in health was permitted. Unprecedented growth of private provisioning in healthcare provisioning, as well as in medical education, subsidized financing only for efficient and effective intervention. It promulgated hegemonic perspective of evidence-based policy. So India had to rely only on the evidence base that was generated in poor economies like South Africa or African nations, sub-Saharan African nation, to invest, whereas it was not priority for Indian government at that time, but that's what India had to resort to. And it unleashed neoliberal market forces, which eroded social protection even further. So what?
Shalini, can I request you to please try and conclude in a few minutes, because
yes,
we are running very late.
I'm so sorry. So basically, the idea was that I was trying to see that this was first case that I'm discussing, and the second case was the emergence of World Trade Organization and intellectual property rights under TRIPS agreement by ratifying Marrakesh Agreement. Now, TRIPS is trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Now, what it did was it actually made products of innovation having a commercial value patentable for a period of 20 years. Now, TRIPS also steered an homogenization of domestic laws across all nations with minimum protection for patentable products, and also permitted use of sanctions for if domestic laws fail to honor TRIPS agreement. Now, the reason why it happened was because World Trade Organization, predecessors to World Trade Organization was GATT agreement, and under Paris Convention, GATT agreement didn't have enough power to enforce intellectual property rights, and its functioning differed from country to country. So to that end, when all the WTO member nations signed the agreement harmonized laws to protect scientific innovation across nations, and it also impacted local domestic innovators' ability to benefit from domestic protectionist policies which were offered before liberalization. So it's needless to say that few technologically advanced nations stood to benefit the most by enforcement of such intellectual property right laws. And patents were used for protecting private investment and for commercialization of the idea of ideas or innovative ideas which prevented other investors or other country nations to reverse engineer these technology products. Now, these monopoly rights are also called as intellectual property rights, where they were safeguarded against, where they were meant to be safeguarded against privacy and misappropriation. Now, following the purely economic reasoning, it was determined that the patent would foster innovation under the protections issued by national government. So IPRs were deemed to be of public interest. Now, this rhetorical justification of IPRs was fueled by debt crisis, oil shock, and stagflation in US and European economies in 1970s. And there's this big literature around how United States International Trade Commission compiled an estimates of expected loss to various businesses due to technological piracy in other nations. And European nation and Japan also combined their efforts together and floated the idea of very stringent so business leaders under the umbrella of United States Trade Representatives used this opportunity of trade deficit crisis to float the idea that stringent protection of intellectual property and innovation extended domestically as well as to foreign countries could save losses incurred due to piracy. Now, these business leaders also drafted the bill that was negotiated at the GATT summit, and such negotiations resulted in the formation of Uruguay round talks, which later created TRIPS agreement. So the point being that there was a phase where stringent intellectual property rights were imposed on nations that were technologically not at the same platform. So the effect of stringent intellectual property rights were immediately reflected in 1980s epidemic of human immunodeficiency virus, the discovery of virus in 1984, and subsequent arrival of first anti-HIV drug in 1987 became a subject of intense debate because the drugs were patented for everyone living outside US and UK, because within United States and United Kingdom, the medicines were provided through public health channel. Now,
I'm sorry to disturb you again, but we do need to.
I just need.
You need to sum it up because we are running very late.
Sorry, I'll just use 2 more minutes if you grant me. So by 2003, studies claim that extortionary prices, only very small percentage of patients living in sub-Saharan Africa and Thailand and India were actually being able to access HIV/AIDS drug. At the same time, when a generic version, a reverse engineered version of HIV/AIDS medicine existed. Now, the case that I wanted to highlight, but because I don't have enough time, was the post-apartheid Nelson Mandela government's government passed a law called Medicine and Related Substance Control Act, which made government of South Africa prioritize the national health over intellectual property right laws, and subsequently led to a big debate and a big international campaign which mobilized a lot of countries and a lot of people across the world to negotiate for a position where developing countries could then access generic medicines and bypass patent laws, and that's called Doha Agreement. And so basically a civil society mobilization is I'm trying to say is that it's an advocacy campaign that we can see as a sort of an achievement in which the boundaries of the subject of economics were broadened, and a lot of other self-determinacy of priorities of developing nations were accommodated. And this created a space for negotiation between hardcore logic of economics versus soft logic of economics, and brought a lot of change from there on. And India has championed all these debates. And there are so many more things that I could say, but I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Shalini. I'm
so
sorry.
sorry.
I had to
My
you,
presentation was very exhaustive. Yeah. I'm so sorry. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah. Thank you. So now let me, without wasting any more time, invite Krishnakumar to speak on Keynes in the undergraduate macroeconomics classroom. Krishnakumar, unmute yourself.
Am I sharing the screen? I think so. I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah, now the screen is visible.
Yes. Thanks, Professor Surajit Majumdar, and thanks to organizers for this opportunity to speak about Keynes in the undergraduate macroeconomics classroom. This seminar comes in the backdrop of how to incorporate pluralism happening elsewhere into the Indian classrooms or in the Indian curricula. That's exactly what the larger domain of this particular session is. I would rather try to be tangentially a little bit different as to how the mainstream textbooks have reflected to the global financial crisis. And has there been any sort of reaction which actually should be taken in its positive spirit and taken forward? In this particular regard, I'm examining certain textbooks. Of course, some textbooks which basically comes from the post-Keynesian stable like that by Mitchell, Ray, and Watts. Of course, such sort of books would automatically be having a very critical take on the nature of functioning of the economy. For example, in this particular new book by Mitchell, Ray, and Watts, they come up with introducing the sectoral balances, trying to say that it's better that the government incurs a deficit so that the firms would have positive cash flows, and therefore too the economy will keep moving. So which means that they typically trying to bring back something called the sectoral balances approach back into economics. Mitchell, Ray, and Watts is trying to make an intervention. They're basically trying to bring in modern monetary theory, etc. But this is exactly what a post-Keynesian textbook would be about. This is exactly what a post-Keynesian textbook which is expected to bring in what is called Keynes's 1937 article logic back into the mainstream would actually be doing. But what are certain other books doing? What are certain other textbooks doing? And of course, all textbooks in the world need not respond creatively despite the global financial crisis, despite the sort of problems of their disassociation with the financial system macroeconomics as a profession had. They needn't respond like that. But there are certain works, like say by Carlin and Soskis, which literally goes for a major overhaul of their book. They have a book being rewritten as Macroeconomics, Institutions, Instability, and the Financial System. And in fact, it doesn't move far away from the mainstream economics. But what I really liked good of Carlin and Soskis' approach is that in their work, they basically try to incorporate what I would say as, they have this three equation model, which is a typical ISPCMR mechanism. But using the same three equation model, they basically try to create some sort of a simulator sort of an exercise and try to prove by taking, get the student to prove by taking data from the different central banks that under a dispensation, when you have extremely low interest rates and when you have deflation in the economy, nothing can be done with monetary policy. One will have to go for fiscal spending. When that is being done through an existent mainstream workforce model, that is the ISPCMR model, which is like the typical new Keynesian apparatus of doing these things, that also is some sort of an intervention which is done. And further, in this particular book, in a later chapter, what they do is they basically try to link as to how the monetary policy transmission mechanism basically breaks out. That is, the central bank can just keep reducing the interest rates, but it's not necessary that the banks should pass over these interest rates to the firms, because they know that these firms are highly leveraged. Some of the firms which are highly leveraged, and they cannot basically move forward precisely because the economy is on the downturn. So logically speaking, this transmission mechanism being broken, this also further is being modeled up. There is a banking, there's a financial leverage cycle which is being built up. I really feel that even when it comes from the part of a mainstream textbook, it is basically trying to indirectly give space to the ideas of Hyman Minsky, to the ideas of John Maynard, etc., through the existent mainstream models. And if somebody comes to a lecturer in Delhi University, from some state university, and asks that for our master's course, what could be a book which you could recommend, which would be readable, which would have say some medium level of mathematical reasoning, and which would have a good laboriously written work, I would definitely say that Carlin and Soskers would do a good task in it. Because in the federal university or federal college systems under which we work, in fact, can Keynes be in the classroom? If the teacher wants, Keynes can definitely be in the classroom. If the teacher doesn't want, Keynes need not necessarily be in the classroom, and the student can do a course on macroeconomics. So we have to know that. To that particular part, I come a little bit later. What I find is that the period has been witnessed to a number of economists. For example, Guillermo Calvo, a renowned new Keynesian economist, in the context of making his theories with respect to this liquidity crisis as a liquidity crisis as part of this financial crisis, when he tries to theorize on it, he says that the single most important point of Keynes, which people started forgetting, is that the whole value of money is underwritten by the static nature or the fixed nature of wages and prices in the system. In fact, what was celebrated as price flexibility was totally bogus. So he resuscitates, he in fact says that, see, this is that elemental truth of the macroeconomy which sometimes economists have been trying to ignore when they basically try to speak too much about price flexibility. But yet he continues with his rational expectations persuasion. So at times, a little bit they give into what was said by Keynes in the past when they try to make an argument. For example, Blanchard says in his American Economic Association 2019 address that, public debt is not a bad thing. There is low interest rates, there's no demand, better we spend. He's saying something like, it's almost like a Domerian debt dynamics is in work when Blanchard is speaking. And Blanchard himself, in his own textbook, starts correcting many of the things and moving a little bit away from the past writings and past textbook parts of his, where he was a little bit adamant, where he was not addressing certain issues. Now he starts addressing these issues. At another work which I found very interesting, possibly of use for educators, would be this book on macroeconomics by Ben Fine and Orani or DiMaggio. This book, of course, is written by people who are critical of macroeconomics, critical of mainstream macro. But one good thing which they have done is that they are presenting the mainstream macroeconomic model, saying that, see, through certain changes in the assumptions of these models, what's the result which we are going to get? So isn't such sort of a critical engagement also not possible? Is something which we should really think when we think in terms of, say, graduate classes, that is in terms of, say, postgraduate classes, or what we call in our country as MA classes. But there has been yet another effort, and that effort is something which is of a celebratory nature, which had happened across continents and across countries, where a number of authors of various persuasions, various diverse persuasions, try to write a more or less mainstream economics textbook only, but which tries to address number of issues like inequality, discrimination, environment, golden age of capitalism, whatnot, and makes the book available also in the form of an app, the core team makes this book called The Economy. And once I tried experimenting certain parts of core The Economy as a textbook for some of my BA program, because the course was too little, too less, that I thought some part of it I could try to experiment with them. And the sort of enthusiasm which the students get when they find that I'm not trying to glorify what one could consider the online learning class. No, it was in the offline mode what I was doing it. At that time, a little bit of online videos, a 3-minute video or a 2-minute video is a very good distraction through which they hear about inequality, a speech being done by Suresh Naidu, or a little bit larger video being done by Arjun Jaydev and Branko Milanovic, which discusses it. So, which means that this also unravels possibilities towards addressing what I would characterize as the core periphery sort of divide in the Indian economics curriculum issue. Because in Indian economics curriculum, there is always an issue. There are a set of universities who are very endowed, whose skills at mathematical levels, mathematical abilities, whose skills of different other sorts is far more better compared to these state universities as well as provincial universities, where their skill sets are not as developed. This gives ample opportunities through little videos, through interventions, through quizzes, through trying to enhance their competencies in mathematics, like that way. In fact, possibly I was thinking that might be core as a textbook succeeds because it is little bit mainstream. It succeeds because it is trying to endogenize aspects of the criticism of the mainstream, even when it refuses not to be mainstream. And possibly that's why Robinson and Eatwell as a textbook, even when it came as a very big critical book, did not work from 1970s. Of course, the lockdown also might have worked in favor of core with respect to some amount of popularization. I would rather think that possibly they were trying to read little bit into John Maynard Keynes when he said that the master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must be a mathematician, a historian, a statesman, philosopher in some degree. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in the light of the past for the purposes of the future. Possibly that might be what is guiding core as a team, core as a particular team, I think. In my own classes at the college where I teach, because there's ample space, people would know that in the BA program, this reflections which I make on the next few slides is essentially on the basis of what I teach in the BA program course. The courses were in the too little, too less, and sometimes we have a lot of time for engaging with these sorts of stuff. So automatically, after reading Hilbruner's essay on John Maynard Keynes, the many worlds of John Maynard Keynes can be introduced, because without simple theory of income determination is just a solution of a particular equation for them. And then you basically have a hydraulic model of that ISLM analysis, which is again a small numerical solution which we do. We don't have any uncertainty, we don't have any expectations, we don't have any history, we don't have any narrative. The narrative is very important. The narrative of that particular period is extremely important. To read about the bank crash, to know what is the bank run, possibly a passage from John Kenneth Galbraith on the crash would be very good, a good read. And that good read would also, and for example, the interventions which, for example, in Treaty of Versailles, when Keynes basically makes this intervention, and he writes a particular book called The Economic Consequences of Peace. In fact, 2 or 3 pages of that. In fact, this teacher should also be a little bit selective with respect to how many pages he gives. And then Keynes' public engagements. For example, was Keynes a person who was an activist trying to promote his ideas, or were his ideas born out of activities, or it was a mutual thing? For example, when one reads Can Lloyd George Do It? All of these things comes from the essays in persuasion, which far precedes general theory, because that was the making of the general theory which he did. And for example, there's this beautiful write-up by Heinz Arndt in one of those edited works where he basically brings out the good cozy relationship between Keynes and Churchill, where they disagree very badly on issues like the return to gold by Britain. But otherwise, there's a very great cordial friendship between the Chancellor of the Exchequer in his role, Winston Churchill, as well as John Maynard Keynes. So that sort of writings, and of course, one of those particular writings, which possibly in the time of global financial crisis was extremely useful, was the impact of the decline in price level on banks, where deflation and its impact on the banking system towards capturing it. A simple, beautiful essay, but with a lot of economics, which does not technically have much of mathematical techniques, though, is able to communicate well. So these are all experiments or exercises which I had made people read and tell the story in summary of the Grapes of Wrath, which actually captures what is called the period of the Dust Bowl refugee period in US, about a very arena of a lot of array of cartoons and pictures and music lyrics from the Eleanor and Franklin Delano Roosevelt archives, the book by Crash, of which already I have told, Money, Whence It Came and Where It Went. And there are these two books of which also I thought one should reflect on. One is by Richard Koo, who writes about the events in macroeconomics as it is happening. And when one reads some events, one traces back some of those basic precepts of Keynes' reasoning in his work. So that is also one way. And I think I was reading this small work on narrative economics by Robert Schiller, where he says that even when an idea is good or bad, there should be somebody who is an icon of a person who should be able to promote it. And the example which he gives is of Ronald Reagan, who actually, as a person who was continually doing a video show on one of those channels for a long period of time, suddenly emerges as a presidential candidate. He defeats the opponent. Whether market liberalism is good or not, he became some sort of an icon of market liberalism, untrammeled market liberalism of sorts. So might be, even when the whole of the global financial crisis occurs, there is a shortage of demand. When people know that this is an issue and this is the Keynes' moment, or possibly it's a Minsky moment, why the ideas related to Keynes basically didn't get endorsed? Might be it lacked an icon, and might be these students or these, because on an interdisciplinary line, there's a notion that Keynes is of economics, but I think we should transcend that boundary and try to give Keynes to the others, possibly to the historians and political scientists and the literature people, because Keynes had a larger world, as has been reflected in the life of John Maynard Keynes by R.F. Harrod. Might be if we transcend those boundaries and allow Keynes to be owned by other disciplines more than appropriate. We are actually not appropriating Keynes. We are having less of Keynes in our own works. Why don't we gift it to others, gift him to others too, so that there is some sort of an icon who will come and see to it that no, austerity policies is not something which we should be pursuing when there is a demand which is lacking in the system. I thought that in this conference on the pluralism on economics, I should also say that how the mainstream textbooks reflect on it and how that could be used as an intervention. And even when it's I think very foolish to expect that mainstream universities would all adopt new textbooks which are being written by economists of post-Keynesian stream. I do not think, but the classroom, the autonomy of the teacher in the classroom could very well be utilized towards trying to make sense of the trying to communicate to the students possibly some elements of the great lineage of John Maynard Keynes. I think I should stop. I didn't cross the time, I assume.
No, Krishnakumar, thank you so much for your presentation, as well as sticking to your time limit.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I didn't need to prompt you. You finished in time. So let's move on now to the final presentation in this session. Ajay Ranjan Singh on formulating a course on the history of economic thought. Ajay, are you here?
Yeah, just a sec. Let me share the screen first. Yeah. Good evening. Let me just get on with the task at hand. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Okay. When I was asked to speak on this topic, and one of the reasons I was asked to, because at the Delhi School of Economics, we are going through another round of what is called syllabus revision. And as a part of that, one has been involved in the formulation of a course on the history of economic thought to be offered at the undergraduate level. And in my memory, as a student and as a teacher in the university at the undergraduate level, this is the first time that such a thing is being offered. Now, in trying to speak about formulating a course, one of the things that initially occurred to me that maybe one should talk more about what are the concerns, academic concerns that one has in mind when one is asked to formulate such a course. And in thinking about it, I realized that it will make more sense for me to share with all of you a brief history of what has happened, at least in this university, in terms of the teaching, or rather the structure of the undergraduate syllabus that we have, and how increasingly some of us are pushed to a point at every stage in the syllabus revision to try and retain at least some papers or subject areas within economics, try to see that they are retained as a part of compulsory papers that the students of economics honors have to do. Or finally, when it becomes absolutely impossible to retain any of these papers, either in the compulsory or as an optional, how one tries to retain some semblance of letting undergraduate students understand that what is taught at the graduate level in the University of Delhi is but a very small fraction of what is usually referred to as the vast area, which we call different approaches. We call it heterodox economics and so on and so forth. So let me get on with the task. So the first instance of, so I'm taking you through almost 20 years that one has been involved with this kind of an exercise, just to give you a sense of what I was talking about. And this actually forms a large part of the background when one ends up formulating a course in the history of economic thought to be offered. But our first experience of these reformulations was when some professors got in touch with undergraduate teachers way back in 1996, 97. I might be 1 or 2 years wrong about this, and finally comes to fruition in 2005. And the second phase was when the semester system was introduced at the undergraduate level, and it took place in 2011. The third phase is when the choice-based credit system was introduced, and it came into effect in 2015. And the fourth phase, I would say, is the one that we are going through right now. It is not yet over. So whatever I'll present about how we are thinking in terms of having a course in the history of economic thought at this level is still in the making. It's not gone through all the hoops through which syllabus revision usually goes through. Now in phase one was a time when the university was in the annual mode. The undergraduate syllabus was of a 3-year duration. And just to give you a sense of the number of core papers, which a student had to go through to get a degree in economics honors was roughly, if I remember right, 13 core papers, and 3 of them were of 100 marks, others were 50 marks papers. Okay. And so if we are to look at the number of papers across which subject areas in economics could be distributed to be taught at this level, one can say that compared to the semester system, in that framework, we had almost 26 papers to deal with different subject matters and areas. So that was the breadth. That gives you a sense of the breadth and the depth to which, even in an undergraduate syllabus, we could go to in formulating this course. Now, it was during this phase that economic systems, the paper which was partly, almost roughly 50% marks in political economy and 50% the economics of social systems, so to say, was reduced from a 100-mark paper to a 50-mark paper under a lot of pressure, because even at that time, a lot of people felt, especially in the department, the main department, that it should not be given the importance that it deserves, that is a full 100 marks paper. And it was renamed as ESS, Economy, State and Society. It was during this phase itself that full-fledged papers on money and banking, public finance, these are all compulsory papers that any student had to take, trade and comparative economic development were all made optional. And political economy was introduced as an optional paper. So what one had to do, was that subject areas that one could cover earlier in a 100-mark economic systems paper, since it was reduced to 50 marks, another paper under the name of political economy was introduced, and the compromise was that it will become an optional paper. While these areas were getting reduced, a compulsory paper, like the ones you have in typical US universities, was introduced, called Principles of Economics, which was a full-fledged 100 marks paper. In the second phase, with the semester system coming into play, the Economy, State and Society paper, which was a compulsory 50 marks paper, was shifted from the 3rd year to the 2nd year to be done in the 4th and later and in the 5th semester. What it did was that the students at this level, because it was shifted a year before to fit in some other papers, teachers who had to teach this paper with those kind of contents had a very, very difficult time, because by the 2nd year, the students were not even well equipped to understand some of the things that one wanted to do in this paper. And the paper was renamed as Political Economy 1 and 2, while Political Economy 1 still remained a compulsory paper, Political Economy 2 became an optional paper. So you see how increasingly the space for these kind of areas to be covered and opportunities that these papers offered for teachers to put across the fact that what is done in the guise of macro, micro, maths or stats, economics goes beyond that, was increasingly getting, progressively getting reduced. In phase 3, when the CBCS system was introduced in 2015, another structural change came into being. So before this, each honors subject were free to have the number of papers they thought are necessary for a student to go through to get an honors degree. Now, the moment the CBCS came, even that was restricted, and the structure of all courses was made identical in terms of the number of papers to be taught. And political economy and economic history, which till then was still retained as a compulsory paper, both of them were made optional papers. And political economy 1 and 2 were shifted back to the 3rd year, that is to the 5th and 6th semesters, respectively. And now in phase 4, we have been given to understand that we should have a paper on economic thought. And it is in this context of increasingly reduced space for these kind of subject areas to be covered at the undergraduate level, that one has had to start thinking in terms of formulating a course. And the draft which was initially discussed was the following. That is Unit 1, the introduction, transition to capitalism, the rise of political economy, and the historical and the theoretical framework and analytical categories of economics as a subject, classical political economy, that is value, price, money, income distribution, macroeconomic setting, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. The early neoclassical economics, demand, supply, price, income distribution, and trade, basically concentrating on Alfred Marshall. And then the last unit was supposed to be effective demand and the origins of macroeconomics, looking at the work of Keynes, Kaleschky, and also Schumpeter to some extent. There were two concerns why this particular thing was framed. One was the fact that, or the primary concern that students, this course should equip students at least to understand a lot of keywords which keep appearing in most of the compulsory papers that they have to do as a part of this undergraduate course. For example, while the term price keeps getting mentioned often, and once in a while, the term value, do they have enough to understand that how the term value came into discussion, how price became the only way to look at markets? So though these terms keep appearing, similarly, when you talk about demand and supply, is there other way of looking at or conceptualizing a market? And so on and so forth. The other concern was how much should be included from the history of economic thought so that it can all be done in one semester, in one paper, in one semester, with 3 lectures and 1 tutorial. This is what we have been given to understand per week, or at the most 4 lectures a week. So these 2 or 3 concerns were there when the initial draft was circulated, and what has been tentatively accepted, and mind you, we have still not gone through all the hoops that one has to go through before it gets finalized, was something like this. And this expansion or going beyond Keynes and Kaleshki was necessitated because some people felt that until and unless other streams or other ways are included, it might not get passed. And this is one concern which was voiced. So one had to take a call on whether we can do all these things within the confines of one semester and 3 lectures and a tutorial per week. But then as a compromise, this is what has been tentatively accepted. I felt that it is necessary for us to understand that in formulating a course, this history of what has happened or what happens through successive revisions of the course is important to even understand that why a course has been formulated in a certain way, other than the usual concerns that go into the formulation of such courses in general, which we all know is like, that if you ask anybody or read anything on this, that any course on the history of economic thought should make or equip students the historical, or make them understand the historical context in which these categories of analysis that we see being used, or different approaches that have emerged. For me, as a teacher at this level, I'll just share 3 examples of what I would be thinking about when I'm formulating a course on the history of economic thought. For example, one of the things that I often ask, and students come to me in the second year of their study, and I teach macroeconomics. When I ask them that, what is competition? The usual answer, which is given in any form, is that they understand competition by this time as a function of the number of agents which are present in the market. Now, for me, a course in history of economic thought should enable me, or at least give me the opportunity to discuss with them the material basis of what they understand as competition, by which, to begin with, they simply treat it as a function of the number of players in a market, so to say. And in doing so, also discuss with them that
Ajay, can I request you to please try and conclude?
I'll just leave the other examples and just link it up to what we understand as a market beyond just the demand-supply analysis that they do. Similarly, can I discuss through this course, or does this course enable me to discuss capital as a social relation, and hence the ontology of power in the capital? Is it just to do with, to be understood as power over someone or something, or something else, and link it up to simple things like, how do you explain a category called profit? So it is some of these things one has in mind when one starts thinking about formulating a course for undergraduate students in economics. I'll stop with this.
Thank you, Ajay. So now we have had the 5 presentations, but we are left with very little time for the discussion because it is almost 8:20. We only have about 10 to 12 minutes. So there are some questions that have come in the Q&A section, which we can take up. Before that, just a couple of remarks. All the 5 presentations that have been made seem to me to be coming from what might be called a somewhat pragmatic approach to the question of pluralism in economics education. A pragmatism that perhaps is derived from the story that Ajay described in the initial part of his presentation, which was about how, in a sense, you could say that the so-called opening up of choice for students has also, over the period of time, has also been a way in which pluralism within the curriculum itself has become, been squeezed out. But that's, of course, part of the story. I mean, I'm counterposing a pragmatic approach in which essentially what you do is you take the structure of an economics program or curriculum as derived from mainstream views as the given, and within that you try and insert some kind of alternative perspectives which allow students to think beyond that, the confines of that mainstream perspective. As opposed to this could be a more ambitious approach to pluralism, where it is defended as a very effective on a pedagogic basis, which is that pluralism and the contention of different ideas about the same reality and the exposure of students to that is also an effective way for them to kind of understand that reality, as opposed to only getting a one-dimensional kind of a view about that particular reality. And of course, there is also the possibility then of exploring the reality from the angle of what is it about that reality that in particular context, in particular situations, gives rise to certain kinds of ideas about that reality. What determines what real ideas at any particular point of time are dominant and which are not dominant. Okay, so it's a different way of where in a sense, the political economy and the historical context of ideas themselves are ways by which you try and understand the reality itself. Unfortunately, we don't live in a world where this kind of an approach is easy to push. So a second best option is you try and introduce something into a more conventional kind of structure, which allows some bit of exposure to students. So I think most of the discussion, most of the presentations have been in that kind of a mode of how, in this kind of a pragmatic mode, which is perfectly valid in the given context. So I have no dispute about that, but maybe the larger context of pluralism in education, in the curriculum, is also something that could be and should be brought onto the debate, even if you cannot actually get a program or a curriculum that is based on that. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and I think I cannot give more than 2 minutes to each speaker to respond to those questions, and I don't think it will be possible to take any more questions. So I request each one of you in turn to respond to the questions that have come. Thomas, beginning with you, there are 2 questions with regard to whether a 21st century political economy syllabus should be incorporating discussions about global value chains, and can it include a discussion of the transition from competitive to monopoly capitalism? So Thomas, if you could please take 2 minutes to respond to these 2 questions that have come for you.
I would certainly say global value chains would certainly be part of the coverage of a syllabus on political economy for the 21st century, and had in particular how, with the latest developments over the last 10 years or so, how the attempts have been made to modify those global value chains, and the emergence of rival trading blocs as a very likely possibility of what is happening now. So I think that is very much there. And as far as the development of monopoly, I understand that it is certainly necessary to put this particular aspect into context. And in particular, I'm referring to the idea that, in Prabhat Patnaik's book, article which I referred to, the concept of imperialism not as playing a functional role, monopoly capital not being a functional aspect of modern imperialism, but monopoly being essentially what capitalism is in modern times. So I think, we should understand that the development of monopoly should certainly be part of the syllabus, and in particular, new types of monopoly which are coming up through the internet. And we all know how some of the most powerful people in the world now owe their wealth to the internet more than anything else. So I think that kind of monopoly must certainly be part of the syllabus. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Shantanu, there are two questions for you. One is that whether the framework that you've laid out is appropriate for an undergraduate syllabus, or is it more appropriate for a postgraduate course? And the second related question is, does it provide a framework through which these issues can be taken to students who are not students of economics, but of other disciplines?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So, in my understanding, whatever I have presented, it was with this understanding that it will be basically a part of the postgraduate program. And because some understanding about political economy is perhaps needed to get any idea about the political economy or initial understanding of political economy will be required to actually gain further insights regarding political approach, economy approach to agrarian studies. Now, coming to the second question, I think that it can be, of course, adapted to students from non-economics background, even though there are elements of economics. But if you have noted, quite a few concepts, the discussions that I had undertaken was actually not really about hardcore economics. Right? Now, for example, say for instance, determination of class, the issue of class struggle, right? So I think it can definitely be adapted to the students from non-economics background. Now, having said that, and I would like to add what Professor Majumdar had just now mentioned, that a larger picture in his comments, that a larger picture about pluralism is essential. Now, for that, in my view, the struggle for alternative or struggle to challenge the ideological hegemony should not just be limited to some courses or some faculty members, some programs, right? It is inextricably related to what is happening in the street, on the streets also. I can take the example of JNU, from where I did my PhD. So JNU, particularly the economics department, at some point.
2 minutes is the time given to everyone. So
okay, so I'll be brief. So I think it has to be. The struggle in the streets and in the classroom should be inextricably linked, and then only better outcomes perhaps. And as far as the second question is concerned, I'm not getting it anyway. So the second question is concerned. Yes, agrarian transition, Britain, Russia, and so on, United States, of course, is important. should provide the students the background. But at the same time, India, I mean, there is so much to learn in India, right? I mean, there is so much variation. There's so variation as far as agroecological conditions are concerned. So the agrarian transition in the context of India, which is much more, I would say, localized in nature, right? So it is not just about agrarian transition in India, maybe agrarian transition in the context of Tamil Nadu, in Punjab, in Bengal, and so on and so forth, need also to be understood. And it is constantly changing, which will add richness to such a discourse, right? So this is all I have to say. I've got very little time, so I don't want to, well.
Okay, Shalini, I don't know whether 2 minutes is adequate to answer the two questions you have, which is one is about whether the definition of pluralism has to be modified to allow for the development of the theory, and what are the lessons India's healthcare system are there any lessons for India's healthcare system from the NHS? So you have to answer in bullet points.
1 minute each. So for the answer to the first question, I think yes, pluralism need to be modified to incorporate things that are tangible, easily capturable through modeling, and things that are not. So things, for example, investment into nutrition, investment into primary healthcare, and development of human resource are quantifiable aspects that somebody can use in modeling when they're trying to see how to incorporate, how to modify teaching in economics. So one is that. Second thing is civil society participation. The presentation, which I couldn't finish, was actually going to say how India's invention in terms of civil society participation, developing scientific prowess, following import substitution policy, process patenting mechanism, and so on and so forth, were key things that projected India into a very important participant in access to medicine campaign. So these are the things that we can use. Like, for example, civil society participation can be modified into a quantifiable variable, or just use it as a discrete variable to see if that can be used in modeling. Human development, as I've already said, is an important aspect. So this is my reply to the first question. The second question was, what can India learn from NHS? Now, there are many things India can learn from NHS, and I can go on about it, but there are two key things that I want to say. One is clinical organization of the clinical governance of the healthcare system, because NHS has a sort of a tiered, structured healthcare services, and the system is that the primary healthcare is provided by private practitioners, private surgeries, they're called general practitioners, that are attached with NHS, and the specialist healthcare are provided by network of hospitals that are directly funded by NHS, under NHS. So these are two tiered sort of structure. So there is no overlap between services of those. So it prevents, it not only creates a sort of a very clear boundary as to where you have to go if you want to seek some service, but it also prevents a lot of overlaps, financial overlaps, and also a lot of preserves investment into creating capacities of specialist nature at primary system, whereas creating primary healthcare services, making primary healthcare services available at hospitals as well. So there's an overlap that it prevents. The second important thing that India can learn is use of competition for financing health service. These two bodies that serve under trust, under NHS trust, generate fund from NHS just by virtue of catering to populations, but they also use quality assessment as a tool to introduce competition. So the NHS trust hospitals compete with one another in terms of claiming that extra fund from NHS based on quality. So that use of competition is a very important thing, that if India wants to go via mixed route, public and private provisioning, then I think competition is one thing that India can pick, and also tiered provisioning, where these two services don't overlap. So that's my 2 minutes.
Thank you. Krishnakumar, your turn. Both questions relate to Keynes' general theory. Can chapter 17 of Keynes' general theory be explained to undergraduate students? And what are the essential ideas of the general theory that are not captured in the 3-equation Neo-Keynesian model? Again, in bullet points, you have to answer. Unmute yourself now.
No, in the although of course the speaker, the questioner basically speaks about marginal efficiency of capital being mentioned in the undergraduate classroom, I do not think even it is mentioned there. You basically have the I curves being given as an investment as a function of the rate of interest. Nowhere it is stopped and told that, you know, your vis-a-vis your interest rate, what should be the marginal efficiency with that time that the interest goes up. It is at the courtesy or the mercy of the teacher that possibly through the student comes to know about it, because it is like when we introduce Keynes, if you introduce Keynes, we could very well introduce it. But coming to this question of chapter 17 of Keynes, essential properties of interest and money, where he develops up through this carrying cost and rate of return and that sort of an own rate of interest model. Possibly to that level, etc., it might not be possible in an undergraduate classroom. But I would always suggest that certain passages or certain small paragraphs from certain chapters, particularly chapter 12, the long-term expectations chapter, where he basically speaks in terms about the liquidity of the stock markets and the fetish of liquidity which it gets transformed into, and particularly that capital development is ill done when enterprise turns out to be a bubble, over enterprise becomes a bubble of sorts in a whirlpool of speculation, some such sort of thing. Brings also in literary style the persona behind Keynes, the way in which he tries to effectively utilize the language, the power of his language towards this process. But a chapter which usually they could very well read from it is the classical theory of interest and the general theory of interest, which Keynes develops up possibly in a little bit more simpler prose in general theory. About the second one, I would say that there were different versions of the 3-equation model which came. Of course, the interest targeting sort of a situation when it came, and the disappearance of the LM curve came. It is during in that context that this Woodford and Homer and others basically had this model of the 3-equation model which came into being. But in Kalin and Soskis's model, they basically try to inextricably bring the real interest rate and investment sort of a linkage, through which they basically try to discuss. So in case you're going to engage with a particular model, try to iterate with some sort of assumptions of the model, might be the results which we think cannot occur through a mainstream model might occur. That could also be something which we could. It does not in any way mean, like how the chairperson himself has said, are we all becoming so pragmatic that, of course, but we should also remember that some people would have can if you have an autonomy over what you teach, then possibly you need not have that sense about. But if you do not have an autonomy over what you teach, then one will have to carve one's own space of autonomy. You should know how to, because we cannot have that same sort of an autonomy which a person who does an autonomous course himself can. When you are in a classroom which is guided by a set of textbooks which are otherwise, whether we like it or not, dominated by mainstream economic theorizing and reasoning.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Ajay, 2 questions to you too. One is it correct to club Marx and Smith and Ricardo? Does it de-emphasize the important differences between Marx and the others? And the second is, in the context of the discussion on neoliberalism, can Hayek be included along with Friedman? Unmute yourself. Ajay, you have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. I'll start with the second one. Again, it can be, but it's again the confines of how much you can do. And as to the first one, that we could not have a separate section just for Marx. So if you have to kind of talk about the surplus approach, Okay. You also have to give a sense. So okay, there are two ways, very quickly, there are two ways of looking at it. De-emphasizing Marx, yes and no. No in the sense that by putting them together, one is also trying to give a sense very quickly in this section that what finds concretion in Marx's idea of a surplus approach does borrow a few things from this line of thinkers, and in this way debunk the claim of some of them who treat Adam Smith, like for example Friedman, as their primary guru, while as if you look at the development of a particular approach, they get clubbed together in that sense, yes. So it achieves both the purposes, that you cannot have a separate section just in Marx for practical reasons. And the other is you also give a feeling that what we call a classical political economy approach, you find its development in the works of all these thinkers.
Okay, so we have, it's 8:38 p.m., so we are 8 minutes over the time, but since nothing was to follow, it's not such a problem. Thanks to all the presenters, all the 5 presenters for contributing to a very rich discussion. If we had more time, I'm sure all of you would have had the greater opportunity to lay out your ideas more clearly. And you could also have had a much more extensive discussion. It is difficult to discuss what is a fairly wide, diverse set of papers in such a short period of time. But that unfortunately is something that we have to live with in these kind of conferences. So you get the benefit of listening to a whole set of ideas, which we might not have if we each one got a lot of time. But the price we have to pay is that we have to do a lot more work ourselves to now know more. The first steps have been taken. Now it's up to us to make the effort of knowing more about what each one of them was actually saying. I hope people will do that, and this dialogue and discussion will continue. So let me thank all the 5 presenters for the contribution to this session, and to all the participants, and hand it back to Kirti for closing the session.
Yeah, so thank you so much, all of you. I think we had great knowledge for the codes to add on, or the readings to add on. And to each one of us who are into academics, I think it's a great learning if we can supplement our students with the new readings, especially to the undergrads if we are handling that. So I think it was a nice learning for a weekend Saturday. So thank you so much, all of you. It's just nice to have you all here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.